High on a dry ridge in southern Turkey stands a pillar of carved limestone taller than a man, shaped by hands that lifted it into place 11,600 years ago. That is older than farming, older than writing, older than the wheel, older than the first fired pot. The people who raised it were not supposed to be able to. They had no metal, no plow, no script, no animal strong enough to haul the stone. For 30 years, archaeologists have measured this place and argued about it and agreed on almost nothing. So, in 2026, 3 decades of scans and surveys and symbol catalogs were handed to something that carried no theory up the hill and no reputation to defend. It was asked one thing: look at everything at once and report only what the stones demand. And it did not reach first for the giants. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to a low mound near the city of Schönlurfa, guided there by a local family who had turned up strange carved stone while plowing their fields. Schmidt had spent years at a nearby site called Nevelu Chori, and he recognized what he was standing on. He began to dig the following year, and what he found consumed the rest of his life. He worked that hillside until he died in 2014, and he never reached the bottom of what it held. What lies under that mound has no comfortable explanation. Ground-penetrating radar has mapped at least 20 great circular enclosures buried in the slope, and only a handful have been opened. Inside them stand pillars of limestone shaped like a capital letter T, some rising more than 5 meters, some weighing several tons, the largest heavier than a loaded truck. And in the quarry nearby lies one that was never finished, a single stone longer than the ones already standing, abandoned mid-cut, as if the work simply stopped one day and no one ever came back for it. These are not rough slabs dragged into a heap. They are carved. Foxes, snakes, boars, wild cattle, cranes, vultures, scorpions, rendered in relief with a control of the stone that stops you where you stand. Whoever cut these knew exactly what they were doing before the tool touched the rock. And then there is the detail that changes what you are looking at. The great pillars at the center of each ring are not abstract. They have arms carved down their sides. They have hands that meet at the front. They wear belts, and beneath the belts, the suggestion of clothing. These are not decorated posts. They are figures. Something is standing at the heart of every circle, faceless, watching, turned outward toward whoever enters. And here is the part that should stop the conversation cold. The oldest of these enclosures was raised around 9,500 years before the Common Era. Sit with that number for a moment. That is before agriculture, before anyone in this region planted a field or herded a flock or fired a clay pot or scratched a single mark that we would call writing. The story we were told, the one printed in every textbook, ran in a straight line. First people learned to farm. Farming fed larger groups. Larger groups settled, and only then, with food secured and time to spare, did they raise anything monumental. Göbekli Tepe takes that line and snaps it in half. The temple, or whatever this was, came first. The farm came after. Klaus Schmidt understood what that meant, and it unsettled him for the rest of his career. Because if hunter-gatherers built this, then everything we assumed about what came before, what has the order wrong. For 30 years, careful people have stood in front of these stones and asked the only question that matters: how? And for 30 years, the answers have all carried the same quiet flaw. Every one of them was shaped by what the person already believed before they climbed the hill. So the question was handed to something that believed nothing at all. Every person who ever studied this place carried a story up the hill with them. Klaus Schmidt saw a temple, a sanctuary raised by people who came together to worship before they ever came together to farm. Others saw a calendar written in stone. Others saw the birthplace of organized religion, the first place human beings gathered around something larger than the next meal. And each of them, however careful, however honest, was doing the same thing in the end. They were reading the stones through the lens of what they already expected to find. The sight never spoke plainly. It answered whatever question it was asked. So the researchers tried something different. They gathered everything. Every three-dimensional scan of every pillar, every radar survey of the buried slope, every catalog of carved symbols, every study of the rock, every measurement anyone had taken in 30 years of digging. They fed all of it into an artificial intelligence, and they gave it no theory to defend, no temple to prove, no religion to honor, no reputation riding on the answer. They told it one thing: look at all of it at once and report only what the numbers demand. And here is why that matters. Because this is not magic. The real problem at Göbekli Tepe was never a lack of intelligence. It was that no single mind holds all of it. An archaeologist reads the stones. An astronomer reads the sky. A geologist reads the rock. A linguist reads the symbols. And they almost never sit at the same desk, because a human career runs deep in one field, not wide across four. The knowledge was scattered across disciplines that do not talk to each other, and the pattern, if there was one, lived in the space between them, where no specialist was looking. A machine does not respect that boundary. It reads archaeology and astronomy and geology and language in the same breath, and it finds the correlations that fall through the cracks between departments. But it is worth being precise about what this thing can and cannot do, because that honesty will matter before we are finished. It finds patterns. It measures where one number lines up with another and flags it when the alignment is too clean to be chance. What it cannot do is tell you why. It cannot reach into the minds of people 11,000 years dead and hand you their intentions. It can show you that a thing was done. It cannot always prove it was done on purpose. Hold on to that, because the line between a pattern and a purpose is where this entire story will eventually turn. And then the machine did something none of them expected. The giants, the great carved pillars that every visitor crosses an ocean to stand beneath, the stones that fill every photograph of this place, it treated almost as background. It was not impressed by size. It had no instinct telling it that big means important. Instead, it went straight for the thing 3 decades of researchers had quietly dismissed as decoration. The carvings, the foxes and the snakes and the vultures scratched into the stone, the images everyone had filed under art. Sit with that for a moment. The machine looked at the giants and looked away. For 3 decades, the carvings had been the beautiful problem no one could solve. Everyone agreed they were extraordinary. No one agreed what they were. Some researchers called them art, images of the animals these people hunted and feared, a bestiary in stone. Others suspected something deeper, a religious language, a code of belief pressed into the rock. But the symbols would not yield. They were cataloged, argued over, and in the end filed away as meaning lost to time, a message whose reader had died out 10,000 years ago. Beautiful and mute. The machine did not see art, it saw arrangement. Because the carvings are not scattered across the pillars the way a decorator would fill a wall. They repeat. The same motifs return again and again, and they return in patterns. Certain animals paired with certain others, certain symbols clustered in certain enclosures and absent from the rest. One ring runs heavy with snakes. Another favors the fox. Another is dominated by the vulture. The machine measured which images appeared together, which appeared alone, and how often, and what came back did not look like the free hand of an artist decorating a shrine. It looked like structure. It looked like combinations chosen on purpose. The way words are chosen, the way a sentence is built rather than spilled. And that raises a genuine possibility that serious scholars have taken seriously. that these carvings are not only pictures, but something closer to a system, an early attempt to encode information in a fixed and repeatable set of signs. Not writing as we know it, not an alphabet, but a step in that direction. A grammar of images. If that is true, then Göbekli Tepe is not just older than writing. It may hold one of the first fumbling attempts at it, thousands of years before anyone was supposed to try. But honesty demands the other side, because this is exactly the kind of claim that runs ahead of its evidence. The symbols have not been decoded, no one can read them. The people who excavated this site for decades caution that the imagery is tangled up with belief and story and ritual in ways no clean code can capture, and that the same motifs appear not only on the pillars, but on stone bowls and small carved plaques, and at neighboring sites across the region. A pattern is not the same thing as a language. Repetition can mean a system, or it can mean a shared tradition, a set of images every carver in this world simply knew, the way every painter of a certain age paints the same saints. The machine found the structure. It could not prove the structure was speech. And yet one thing survives even the most careful doubt. Whatever this vocabulary of images was, the same grammar of it repeats across enclosures that were built at different times by different hands. The rules held. A carver working generations later still reached for the same signs and the same relationships. That is a standard. And a standard is a strange thing to find here, because a standard means the knowledge existed somewhere before the stone did, carried in the mind, agreed upon, passed on. Which points at one pillar in particular, the most argued over stone at the entire site. They call it Pillar 43, and most people who have stood before it call it the vulture stone. It sits in the enclosure the excavators labeled D, and it is the most argued over slab at the entire site. A vulture with one wing outstretched, holding a disc, a scorpion, a crane. Other creatures scattered across the surface, and beneath them, harder to explain, the figure of a headless man. For years, no one could agree what any of it meant. Then, in 2017, two engineers from the University of Edinburgh, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, offered an answer so bold it made headlines around the world. The animals, they argued, are not animals at all. They are constellations. Read the vulture and the scorpion and the rest as star patterns, they said, and the disk becomes the sun sitting in a particular place in the sky. And that arrangement, they claimed, points to a single date, around 10,950 years before the Common Era, the moment a swarm of comet fragments struck the Earth and plunged the world into a 1,000-year winter. Pillar 43, in their reading, is not decoration. It is a date carved in stone, a memorial to the day the sky fell. They put the odds of coincidence at less than 1 in 50,000. It is a breathtaking claim, and the people who have spent their lives digging this site do not accept it. Their rebuttal, led by Jens Nautroff, Oliver Dietrich, and Lee Clare, is precise, and it is damaging. First, they say, the reading cherry picks. Pillar 43 is one of more than 60 carved pillars at Göbekli Tepe, and the theory fixes on this single stone while ignoring the rest, including details on the very same pillar that break the story. That headless man, read as a symbol of mass death, is also, unmistakably, a figure with an erect phallus, an image of life, not extinction. You do not get to keep half of him. Second, and harder to escape, the dates do not fit. The comet is supposed to have struck around 10,950 before the Common Era, but the oldest radiocarbon date from this enclosure is 700 to 1,000 years younger than that. The pillar would have to have been carved centuries before the site it stands in existed. The chronology runs backward. And third, the whole thing rests on the assumption that these hunter-gatherers saw the same constellations we inherited from the Greeks and the Egyptians thousands of years later. There is no reason to believe the sky was carved into those same shapes in their minds. The scorpion is only Scorpius because we decided it was. It is worth adding that the comet impact itself, the catastrophe the whole theory hangs on, remains disputed among Earth scientists to this day. So sit with where that leaves us. Give a mind 60 pillars and an entire sky to point at, and something will always line up. The honest test is whether the pattern survives the people trying to kill it. This one has not yet. And that restraint is the point. There is one pattern the machine flagged that refuses to go quiet, and it runs in the wrong direction. When you line the enclosures up in the order they were built, the oldest ones are the most ambitious. The earliest circles hold the tallest pillars, the deepest carving, the most confident hands. And as the centuries pass, the work gets smaller, the pillars shrink, the relief grows shallower. The later builders, standing on top of everything their ancestors had achieved, seem to be doing less with it, not more. The peak is at the beginning. This is where the story gets seductive and dangerous at the same time, because there is a reading that says the knowledge was leaking away, that these people did not invent their skill and build upon it the way we expect civilizations to do, that they inherited something already complete and slowly, generation by generation, forgot how to wield it. It is a haunting idea. It is also not what the evidence most plainly shows. The simpler explanation is that the society was changing. These centuries are exactly when this world was drifting toward settled life, toward planted fields and penned animals and smaller homes. A people turning into farmers do not need giant ceremonial rings the way their wandering ancestors did. The architecture gets smaller and more domestic because the lives inside it are getting smaller and more domestic. That is not a lost golden age draining out of them. That is a culture changing what it needs. The machine can show you the decline. It cannot tell you whether it was tragedy or simply transition, and honesty means holding both. And there is more beneath the surface, literally. The radar does not stop at the enclosures we can see. It reads earlier structures buried below them, older phases of building hidden under the ones Schmidt spent his life uncovering, which means Göbekli Tepe is not the beginning of this story. It is somewhere in the middle. Whatever these people knew, they were already deep into knowing it when they raised the stones we can touch. But the finding that truly changes the scale is that Göbekli Tepe was never alone. When researchers widened the lens beyond this single hill, a network came into focus. Across roughly 200 kilometers of southern Turkey, more than a dozen sites share the same signature, the same T-shaped pillars, the same carved snakes, the same deliberate sealing of buildings at the end of their use. Karahan Tepe, with its chamber of 11 pillars rising from the bedrock and human faces carved with startling realism. Symbolic, Sefer Tepe, Çakmak Tepe. This is now a coordinated Turkish research program. The Tas Tepeler project, led by archaeologists including Necmi Karul, and it has turned a lone marvel into an entire vanished world. Sit with what that requires. Not one band of hunters raising one strange monument, but many communities across a wide land, building in the same style, carving the same symbols, following the same rules for 15 centuries. That is not improvisation. That is organization on a scale nobody thought these people possessed. An organization like that raises a question the stones themselves cannot answer. Who was holding all of this together and how, so long before anyone was supposed to be able to? There is one last thing the stones did, and for a long time it was the strangest detail of all. At some point, the enclosures filled up. The great pillars ended up packed to their shoulders in rubble and earth, the carvings sealed away in the dark. And when Klaus Schmidt found them, they had survived an extraordinary condition, protected for 10,000 years by whatever had covered them. And Schmidt believed that covering was deliberate. He thought these people had chosen to bury their own temple, to wrap it and enter it like a body, sealing a message they trusted the future to eventually dig up and read. It is a beautiful idea, and it is the one his own colleagues have quietly stepped back from. Because when the excavation team looked harder at the fill, the picture grew less romantic and more human. Much of that rubble looks less like a careful burial and more like collapse. Walls that fell, slope that washed down the hillside over centuries, debris that slid and settled and slowly swallowed the stones without anyone deciding it should. There is real evidence that some buildings were deliberately filled in at the end of their lives, packed with rubble and sculpture on purpose. But the grand vision of an entire sacred site lovingly entombed as a gift to the future that the diggers no longer feel the evidence supports. The mystery did not get bigger, it got quieter, and in a way, more true. And yet what remains is strange enough. Sculptures were buried on purpose in some of these rooms. Buildings were closed with what looks like ceremony, a kind of ending performed rather than an abandonment. And there are marks on the tops of some pillars, small hollows cut into the stone, that show people kept coming back to these places long after they went dark. They did not simply walk away and forget. They returned. They touched the old stones. Whatever these rings meant to them, the meaning outlived the building. So let me be as clear as I can, because this is where these stories usually go off the rails. This is not aliens. There is nothing in the rock, nothing in the tool marks, nothing in the carving that requires a visitor from anywhere but Earth, and it is not the wreckage of some drowned super-civilization handing its secrets to savages. The chisel marks are human. They match the hands and the tools of the people who lived right there. The forgetting is human. The returning is human. The instinct to close a sacred thing with care rather than just abandon it is one of the most human instincts there is. Everything remarkable about this place was done by people. That is not the small version of the story. That is the enormous version, because it means human beings, with nothing but stone tools and rope and muscle and each other, standing at the very edge of everything we call history, reached up and built this. No gods required, no lost masters, just people, earlier and more capable than we ever gave them credit for. And the machine, for all it found, cannot tell us the one thing we most want to know: where the idea came from in the first place. So stand back and look at the whole of it. People with no farms, no metal, no writing, no wheel, no animal to pull a load, who quarried stone taller than themselves, carved it with a steady hand, raised it into rings, and repeated that feat across 100 miles of country for 15 centuries. And they did it before the things we were told had to come first: the temple before the farm, the gathering before the grain. That is the reversal Göbekli Tepe forces on us. Not a story about aliens, but a harder question. Where did hunter-gatherers find the coordination, the labor, the shared language of symbols this early? Was it invented on that hill or carried in from somewhere older we have not dug up yet? The machine is already being aimed at the next site in the network, so tell me, which hill do we read next? Hill.